Hello everyone, my name is Konstantin Baum. I'm a master of wine and I'm going to talk to you today about Alicante, a region in the southeast of Spain, a very interesting region, a region that I also had to work my way into in the beginning because I didn't really know all that much about it, to be really honest, but I can tell you there's quite a lot of interesting stuff happening in Alicante, quite a lot of new developments and a very long history as well. So it's definitely worth learning more about this region. So we are in the southeast of Spain, right on the Mediterranean. So we have on the one side the influence of the Mediterranean Ocean, but we are also in the south of Europe in a very warm climate. So the further you go inland, the warmer it gets. The area is also really dry. There's not a lot of rainfall coming down. The soils tend to be sandy, loamy soils. We also have some chalk and limestone in this region. But overall, the soils are pretty poor. So the vines really have to dig deep in order to get access to water. And if you look around the region, look at the vineyards, you can definitely see quite a lot of old, gnarly vines that look like they've struggled for all of their life, and that's obviously a good thing when it comes to wine. In general, you want those vines to struggle for them to produce lower yields and produce higher quality of wine. And you can definitely find that in Alicante and also for a long time. So there's definitely a long history dating back to the Phoenicians. So before the birth of Christ, there was already wine production in this region. The access to the Mediterranean obviously made it easier for the people working there, living there, making wine there, to sell it to other countries because wine was mainly transported on ships. And the port of Alicante, the city of Alicante, was also a trading hub for the international wine trade back then. In the 15th century, one wine in particular from Alicante was really famous all around the world. The Fondillon, which is often confused with a fortified wine, which is not actually true. They use raisin grapes that are raisined on the vine that then ferment to very high levels of alcohol, above 15 degrees in many cases, and some residual sugar. They are then aged in barrels in a Solera system. And those wines were already really famous all around the world, probably also because of the standing of the wines in that region back then. The King of Aragon regulated the wine production in Alicante in 1510 and created something very similar to today's appellation system, which is really interesting because if that is the case, and the people from Alicante have really spent quite a lot of time researching this, but if that is the case, they are actually the first appellation of origin in Europe and probably also in the whole world, which is a fascinating thing for a region that is maybe not super well known today. Having this long history, having so much to look back on, is obviously also really inspirational for the winemakers in the region. In the 19th century, Alicante was actually a really big production area with more than 93,000 hectares of vineyards. During the phylloxera crisis, they actually sold quite a lot of wine to the rest of Europe as their vineyards were failing. I mean, the vineyards outside of Alicante in many other markets, especially in France, were failing. They actually managed to supply those markets with affordable and good wine. But in the 20th century, Alicante also kind of lost its identity and it decreased in size quite significantly. There are only roughly 10,000 hectares of vineyards planted today. And there was a long period when it was really difficult for a producer in the region because there was not a lot of drive towards quality. But this has changed over the last few decades, and there are some really interesting producers making quite exciting wines, and we will taste some of those wines today. The grape variety that is most associated with Alicante is Mourvedre, Monastrell, Mataro, whatever you want to call it. Down there they call it Monastrell, and it's a grape variety that rarely actually appears as a single grape variety wine. Obviously, the most famous example outside of Alicante is Bandol, where they also produce single grape red wines from Mourvèdre in that case. But this grape variety can produce outstanding qualities. It is not easy to handle because it can be a little bit rough, a little bit harsh. But if it finds the right growing conditions, and they tend to be close to the Mediterranean Sea in dry, sandy soils, Monastrell can actually produce really outstanding examples. We will taste one Monastrell in this tasting for sure. We have to. But you can find other grape varieties in the region as well. You can find Garnacha Tintorera, which is actually Alicante Boucher. You can find Garnacha. You can find Syrah, Shiraz. You can find Bobal. You can find Cabernet Sauvignon. And there's even Pinot Noir planted in the region. There's also Tempranillo there, some other grape varieties. So there's a bit of a mix of international grape varieties and indigenous grape varieties that are only grown here or only grown in the Iberian Peninsula. On the white side, you can find mainly Moscatel grapes. Musca of Alexandria is the most famous white wine coming out of the region. You can also find Ayren, the most widely planted grape variety, or one of the most widely planted grape varieties in the world. There's also Macabeu, there's Chardonnay. There's again a whole range of different varietals that are being used in the region. Another interesting fact about Alicante is that it has the largest certified organic vineyards in Spain, and probably in one of the largest in the whole world. So that is obviously also due to the climate in the region, which doesn't create a lot of problems in the vineyard. So there's not a lot of disease pressure, as it is fairly dry, windy and warm. So you don't really have a lot of issues. So you can definitely, or it's easier than in many other regions, to reduce spraying in the vineyards, reduce certain methods and products in the vineyard, and convert to organic viticulture. So the first one is the 2021 Oscar Mestre Insurrecte Moscatel Tierras de la Marina. Oscar Mestre is a young winemaker who makes quite interesting wines. You should definitely follow him on Instagram. He posts quite regularly from the vineyards and from the winery, and you get a little bit of an impression of how he works. This is a bit of a more exotic kind of wine. This is a Moscatel which was actually macerated on the skins for quite a long time and then matured in clay amphoras or clay pots. He harvested those grapes by hand and then fermented them in barrels, in 350-liter barrels, and then moved that into clay pots, into those clay pots. And in the end, there was actually a slight film forming on top of the wine, if I understood him right. So a little bit like what you would get in sherry, a little bit of a yeast layer on top of the wine, which might give the wine an additional dimension. I didn't really pick up on that on the nose when I tasted this wine previously, but it is really interesting. I mean, Moscatel was a grape variety that I, for a long time, didn't really taste all that often, but I find that it is a grape variety that can produce really exciting wines. It is quite aromatic and it can be quite blousy if it's not managed well. But especially when it comes to wineries that are working more in a natural way, it oftentimes can get really exciting when it's harvested early. Get these crunchy flavors, fresh acidity, great texture, and low alcohol levels, and it's quite appealing. But I should taste this first in order to really talk about this. So yeah, this is really fresh and fruit driven. You have aromas of tangerines, orange peel. There's a little bit of peachiness coming through as well. On the palate, it's really linear and very fresh and vibrant, really lively. It's not big at all. You don't sense that it's from the south of Europe. you really get the feeling that this is a lively, a fresh and vibrant wine. And this is Muscat of Alexandria, the grape variety, one of the Muscat grape varieties. Muscat à Petit Grain, for example, is maybe a little bit more well known, but Muscat de Alexandria is also a really old Muscat grape variety with a long tradition. It is sometimes used for the production of raisins, but in this case you can clearly see that it produces pretty outstanding, really refreshing, lively and exciting wines. This grape variety is mainly found in Marina Alta in the north of the appellation, so close to the Mediterranean Sea, where you get a lot of influence from the sea and have a slightly cooler climate in order to produce these expressive and fresh wines. Good start. Let's move on to the next wine. So the next one is the 2021 Triga Chardonnay Fermentado en Barrica from Bodegas Volva. Bodegas Volva was founded in 2004 by Rafael Caninzares, who is an enologist. They actually produce wines in different parts of Spain, and they try to focus on indigenous grape varieties and old vines. Here we have, though, an international grape variety in Chardonnay. Grape variety that is planted pretty much all over the world, and a grape variety that is actually able to adapt to very different climates. So you can find that grape variety in the north of France or even in Germany, quite widespread nowadays, but you can also find it in warmer climates. You obviously need to look for spots that allow the grape variety to not get too rich and concentrated. And one important element when it comes to the production of Chardonnay is often limestone, and they actually have Chardonnay plants planted on limestone soils, which is an element that is often regarded as giving the Chardonnay a certain elegance, freshness, a little bit of more reduced, less expressive fruit flavor, which can be really appealing with Chardonnay. This is actually fermented and aged in French barriques, and they do also quite a bit of batonnage, which is also quite traditional in Burgundy, where Chardonnay basically has its origin. So they have actually produced a more concentrated and expressive style of Chardonnay that is influenced quite a bit by the oak, but that also shows some really good fruit flavors. So it smells of citrus flavors. There's also some oak flavors coming through, a little bit of chocolate and cacao powder. On the palate, it's rich. There's also quite a bit of concentration, but there's also acidity. So freshness coming through, breaking up all this body. You can certainly feel the influence of the oak, but you can also feel the influence of the batonnage. So the creaminess that you get when you stir up the lees on a regular basis in order to extract some of those proteins from the lees. But I think it's really well balanced. International grape varieties in Alicante is an interesting topic. I think there was a period when wineries were kind of switching towards more international varieties, but right now I sense that there's a move back to the more indigenous grape varieties that not everyone else produces. I think both strategies can work. I think here, obviously, it's easier sometimes to sell a wine that has the label Chardonnay, because people know what Chardonnay is, and then they might get interested in the region of Alicante as well and start tasting different wines. On the other hand, I often find that the more interesting it gets more interesting when the wineries actually use very distinct indigenous grape varieties, and that obviously also exists quite a bit in Alicante, and we'll see that with the next one. So the next one is the 2019 Pepe Mendoza Giro de Abac Casa Agricola. And Pepe Mendoza is actually one of those really interesting characters in the region. I think every growing, developing wine region needs some of those people who are real like ambassadors for the region, and he's certainly one of those people. He has a winery with 12 hectares of vineyards where he grows Muscat of Alexandria, but also Giraud, this grape variety that is in this blend, a grape variety that is not in this wine, a grape variety that is not really widely known. It's basically, you can find some of it on Sardinia, for example. In the Mediterranean area, there are some places where you find Giraud, but it is, well, somewhat of a less well-known grape variety, probably also because it's not so easy to grow. It yields, or it produces low yields. It can be affected by mildew easier than other grape varieties, so you really have to watch the vines, the vineyards a little bit more, and accept a little lower production from the vines. I thought this was a really interesting, exciting wine because it was just so different, perfumed, elegant, and really well made. So it's fermented in 1,000 liter vats with some of the stems, and then it's matured in 500 liter oak vessels. So you don't really, well, he doesn't really want oak influence here. He wants a little bit of oxygen to get into the wine to make it a little bit more interesting and maybe also a little bit more age-worthy. So this smells of cherries. There's some strawberry flavors coming through as well. There's also a little bit of spice, licorice, a little bit of black pepper coming through. I read some wine journalists describing this as the Nebbiolo of southern Spain, or a Mediterranean Nebbiolo style. I understand what he means. There's quite a lot of these different flavors coming together that you also find in Nebbiolo. But now let's see whether it is on the palate in any way similar to Nebbiolo. Well, it's not quite like Nebbiolo in its structure, but I again understand the comparison. It has quite a bit of grip, the tannins are present, there's great freshness there, there's also beautiful body there, but it's not as harsh at all. It's more fruity, more velvety on the palate. It has great texture, a very long finish. I think this is a really interesting grape variety, something that, in my opinion, taste-wise goes more into the direction of Pinot Noir. So it's not a big and opulent wine. It's more of a fine and elegant wine that will go really well with, for example, game dishes, or you could also go in the direction of beef fillet. So if you don't, or even veal fillet. So you don't really want too much power here on the plate, as this is an elegant wine, really good, really well made. So the next one is the 2021 Siete Bancales Shiraz from the Altana region, which is at 800 meters above sea level, so quite high up in altitude. And they've created a very interesting project up there. They actually are self-sufficient. They produce their own energy, their own water. They use biomass in order to produce electricity. And they're also quite hands-off when it comes to winemaking. They use low levels of sulfites. They also use natural clarification, and they're really trying to produce, well, a wine that expresses the landscape, the vineyard. They do also have, and I have to mention that, they do also rent out little houses that look like a barrel on their side. So you can rent out your little lodge, your barrel lodge, and sleep in a barrel if you want to overnight, which looked pretty cool. I haven't been there yet, but I looked at the photos and found that quite impressive. So here we have Shiraz. They also call it Shiraz. The grape variety is obviously also known as Syrah, but they are going for a more concentrated, dense style here. They also use US oak barrels in order to give the wine a more Shiraz-like flavor profile. Obviously, there's a bit of a difference when it comes to Syrah and Shiraz. Shiraz's tend to come from Australia, and there they are often aged in American oak barrels and are a little bit more concentrated. They have more alcohol and a little bit more generous and rich, whereas Syrah from France is oftentimes a little bit more elegant. Here they are looking for the Shiraz expression. And the wine smells of ripe fruit. It is also quite concentrated in color if you look at it, so it's quite dense and dark. It smells of blueberries, blackberries. There's a little bit of pepperiness coming through as well, and you also find the vanilla flavors that tend to come from the American oak barrels. On the palate, it's actually quite juicy and rich. I mean, it's not as powerful as some Australian Shirazes would be, and I don't mind that at all. I think it's actually really well balanced. So everything is kind of in balance. You have good fruit flavor, ripe tannins, good freshness, and I think this is an interesting project, a fairly new project, so I'm looking forward to seeing more from them. So the next one is the 2019 Finca Colado Vade Bo. Finca Colado is an old farmhouse that was converted into a winery. It sits on the hill that separates Salinas from Villena, and in that area the water actually doesn't drain off into the other valleys, and therefore there's like a brackish lagoon underneath the earth that supplies the vineyards with enough water. They want to focus on autochthonous old grape varieties, and they have some really exciting wines made from different kind of esoteric grapes, like this one here. I mean, this is their Bobal, which is a grape variety that was fairly widely planted in the region before, but now there are only 2.5 hectares in existence. But it's a grape variety that has quite a lot of potential in the region. So especially after tasting this wine, that kind of confirmed my thoughts on Bobal. So it's interesting to taste this here. The winemaker is Juan Guya, and he's a very passionate winemaker who's really interested in learning more, educating himself, and understanding his vineyards better. This is from old vines. They are 50 years old. The grapes are hand-picked, and they are 50% whole bunch. So they use 50% of the whole bunch, and the rest is destemmed, and then they do a spontaneous fermentation. From the whole bunches, you also get a little bit of spice, a little bit of grip from the stems. So that's an interesting element here in this wine. It is actually quite a dark colored wine, so it has quite a lot of intensity in terms of color. The flavor is very appealing, so you get some flavors of plum. There's a bit of spice, a little bit of black tea flavors coming through as well. So it's quite complex and quite interesting. So there's also lifted aromas that remind me again of strawberries. On the palate, you got lots of concentration. There's intense body, good grip, a lot of freshness in the end. So it's not a big and heavy wine. It's quite a lively wine. It's obviously still young, so this is something that can also age a little bit further. But it is beautiful in the way it is, and I always find it exciting to taste wines made from grape varieties that are not very common, that are made in such a brilliant way. I think this is really exciting. So the last one is the 2020 Patojo Patrimonio Monastrell Ecologico from Bodega Las Virtudes, a cooperative with more than 500 members in the region. I think it's quite important to also look at cooperatives, as they also make up an important share of the industry in Alicante. And we obviously also had to look at Monastrell as a grape variety, the most important grape variety in the region. I would have loved to include more Monastrells in this tasting, but I also wanted to show some diversity here. So they have actually invested quite heavily into the quality of their winemaking, have built new facilities in order to make sure that they are producing top-notch wines. This is 100% Monastrell, aged for 10 months in barriques. So they've left it in barriques to mellow it out a little bit, give it a little bit of roundness. They also produce, by the way, olive oil. So they've started producing olive oil in the late 90s, and some of that production is also organic. But back to the wine. So this is obviously a dense and dark red wine. There's quite a lot of color, quite a lot of intensity. It is still fairly young. So this is the 2020, so only 2 years old roughly, but it is open, beautiful, and fruit-driven. There's quite a lot of cherry fruit, blackberries, strawberry notes coming through. The oak is not too pronounced. It's well integrated. It doesn't give the wine too much of this smoky dimension. It's quite fruit-driven and quite clean, quite clear. On the palate, it actually shows good grip, good intensity. The tannins of Monastrell come through certainly, but they are well managed, so it's not aggressive at all. It's already approachable. It might need another 2 or 3 years in order to completely mellow out. But if you want to drink this right now, you should drink it with some meat. Have like a medium rare fillet, a steak, anything like that, in order to give the tannins something else to chew on. But this is kind of the expression of Alicante Monastrell that I was looking for. Quite clear, intense, grippy, but not overly structured and tannic. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned something about Alicante today. What you should do now is get 1 or 2 bottles of Alicante wine and taste the wines yourself. Do this tasting in an abbreviated form at home, or just get 6 bottles. I won't judge you. In order to really experience the region, I will certainly keep an eye on what's going on in Alicante, because I think there's more to come from that region. Thank you to Alicante DOP, and thank you all for watching, and I'll see you somewhere on the internet.